It's going to be fun.
But
Without further ado,
thanks.
I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Leah. Appreciate it. Thanks to Charlie for filming us and for the museum for letting us come and participate. This is always kind of fun for me. Thanks for coming. Well, Martha Washington is one of my favorite ladies that we don't talk about all that much. She kind of gets lost in the shuffle about her husband. So you can't talk about Martha without talking about George, so I did bring a couple of things of his, but I didn't want to be overbearing with George. We could do a lot more on him, but I want to talk a little about her. She was an amazing lady. She was born on June 2nd, 1731, making her 8 months older than George when she was born. And she was born in Chestnut Grove Plantation in New Kent County, Virginia, roughly 35 miles away from Williamsburg. Williamsburg would play a key part in their relationship because that's where we think that George first met Martha, was in Williamsburg. We know that there were at least 2 trips that he made there in 1758 before they were married on January 6th of 59. But that was after she'd put in an earlier life with her first husband. Martha Dandridge eventually married, and she had but before that time, I should talk a little about her education. She had a good education for a woman at that time. Women generally were not educated, but she was it was a farm family, or her father was a farmer, and they weren't real well-to-do, but they were better off than many. And she grew up in Virginia. She had 3 brothers and 4 sisters. She may have also had a illegitimate half-sister born into slavery, Anne Dandridge Costin, and an illegitimate white half-brother, Ralph Dandridge. Those have been alleged. We don't know for sure. Her father was well connected, though, with the Virginia aristocracy, in spite of his lack of wealth, and she was taught to behave as a woman of the upper class right from the beginning. She received a relatively high education for the daughter of a planter, though it was still inferior to that of her brothers, who were given more formal. She took to equestrianism early on. She loved horses, and she got in a little trouble when they were staying at her uncle's house once by riding a horse up 3 flights of stairs and down. But her father intervened with the uncle and said he was proud of his daughter. He could pull off that event, so she didn't get in trouble for it. She married Daniel Parke Custis. We don't know a lot about her early life. And part of us do that, if you don't write, you're forgotten. And she didn't write a lot, but what she may have written, she may have destroyed, because she was famous for getting rid of old letters, particularly the last year of her life. But we do know she was married to Daniel Parke Custis, a very well-to-do, wealthy planter in Virginia, and they married on May 15th of 1750. He was 2 decades older than her, and generally people got married about 27, and he was 38 when he got married, and she was still a teenager when she married him. They had 4 little children: Daniel, who was born in 1751, Francis, born in 1753, John, born in 1754, and Martha, named after the mother, born in 1756. Daniel died in 1754, and Francis in 1757. Neither reached their 5th birthday. And then, of course, her husband passed away in 1757. He got a very severe infection and passed away very suddenly in 1757. And she became, by inheriting his wealth, which includes 17,500 acres of property and over 350 slaves. She inherited a lot of property. Slaves were part of the estate back then in Virginia. That total inheritance, cash-wise, amounted to approximately $33,000 at that time, which is the equivalent of $1,139,000 in 2024. But that didn't include the 17,500 acres of land. That was just the cash settlement and the 300-plus slaves. Legal and financial matters of her inheritance were very complex. After the death of her husband, she had 2 living children, one of whom, Patsy, had epileptic fits and seizures quite often, and used to scare them to death on that. So she was grieving the death of her mother, who had died suddenly in 1758, her husband, who died at that time, and 2 young children that had died earlier of the 4 that she had had with her first husband. But despite all that, and despite her grieving over all those relationships, she was left with the responsibility of managing this and overseeing 5 different plantations at the same time that she inherited. And she did a magnificent job. In fact, after her first husband died, she handled the London merchants on selling tobacco, which was the main crop there in Virginia at the time, and getting good prices for them. She had a business mind. She was very bright. Well, you can well imagine that at her age, she was only 26 or in the early 20s when she met George Washington. George Washington stood 6'2". She stood about 5 feet, we think. So there was over a foot difference in height. But she was also dating a gentleman by the name of Carter, who was very well placed, even financially better than Washington, who had inherited from his brother Mount Vernon. And Mount Vernon was just a tiny little place. This tiny little place at the time. And she's the one that used her wealth and allowed him to use the wealth to increase the size of Mount Vernon to what it became and what it is now in size. Well, she had several, like I say, young men that wanted to date her, and she had no, she was one of the wealthiest women in Virginia at this point. But more importantly than that, we're told that she was very pretty, and she was still young, and she had a very engaging personality. Everybody loved Martha. She was very easy to get along with, very easy to talk with. We don't know exactly when George met Martha. We think it was 2 different meetings in 1758, even before the death of her husband in 1757. We think they probably knew each other because they went around the same social circles. But we don't know any of that. That's all been guesswork. But we do know that she was very impressed with George Washington, the military man, and that they really hit it off. They were deeply in love. It wasn't just a marriage of convenience. They were very close when they got married on January 6th of 1759. They got married at her previous husband's plantation, which was known as the White House. Which is kind of appropriate. She actually never lived in the White House. The only president and first lady that didn't live there because it wasn't built yet. They lived in New York and Philadelphia, but never made it there, although Washington helped lay out Washington, D.C. It's named after him. The couple honeymooned at the Custis family White House plantation, as I mentioned, followed by a stay in Williamsburg, where her husband was a representative of the House of Burgesses, so he was already involved with some political things. Before setting up their house at his home, Mount Vernon, which they moved to Mount Vernon's estate. At the time of their wedding, I can say she was probably one of the wealthiest widows in the entire 13 colonies. Their marriage remained happy over the following 40 years, in part because of their very similar worldviews. It was a marriage based on mutual respect and shared habits, with both maintaining similar schedules in day-to-day life, and both prioritizing family and image over excitement and any vices they didn't have. Well, just a few more things on her early life that I thought were really interesting. As I mentioned, at the time of the death of her first husband, she had lost other family members also at that time, including 2 children. So she started life with George Washington. Eventually, within a few months, they moved to his home, Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon at the time was kind of a tiny little place. If you look at some of the early designs of it, she's the one that turned Mount Vernon into what it became. Using her wealth, she actually had a very interesting relationship with George. She loved George Washington so much that, unlike, it was only widowed women or women that grew up with it, inherited, that could own property at that time. And if her husband was alive, she wouldn't own it, it would be in his name. But after he died, she ended up with all of that property, 5 plantations, 300 and some odd slaves, and so on working. And she was decided wholeheartedly not to write up any prenuptial agreement, which was what you would do at that time if you were a widow or something with a lot of property. There weren't very many widows that had a lot of property. But it shows the respect she had for George Washington by just turning over everything to her new husband. He let her run the plantation pretty much, but she let him do what he wanted to as far as adding new crops or adding new fields or so on, and adding land, which they used her inheritance to increase the size of Mount Vernon many hundreds of acres, and also to, how many of you have been to Mount Vernon? It's a beautiful place. But at any rate, they expanded it greatly, and the home there at Mount Vernon was tremendously expanded, mostly from her designs and her money, but George led the charge on getting it done. And she was perfectly all right with that. She turned everything over to him. Some people don't realize that the sacrifice that this first couple of the United States made. In the early days of and I should mention too that George was a wonderful father to those 2 children. Like I say, Patsy was epileptic, and at age 17 she got into a horrible epileptic seizure which took her life. And he never got over that because she basically just died in their arms. And that was very sad to him. So out of her first 4 children, or her 4 children, she had a last surviving child, John, that they called Jackie. And after he got through King's College, Jackie fell in love and married Eleanor Calvert in February of 1774, and they had 4 children. The Washingtons had hoped for more children throughout their marriage, but they were unable to conceive. So I think one of the interesting things about Washington and Lincoln is that neither one of them have direct descendants. I'm actually related to his mother, Nancy Hanks, but it's on Lincoln through a circuitous pattern. Okay, it's not direct. Neither Washington nor Lincoln have direct descendants alive. We go through Lincoln's, but they had some, but they've all died out. And Washington wasn't able they weren't able to have additional children. But he was a wonderful father and grandfather and great-grandfather to her children and the ones that came through those marriages. Well, and they never really got over the death of Patsy because that was a traumatic experience when they tried to get her through that seizure that took her life. At any rate, the Washingtons' life of marriage was pretty much bliss, other than the deaths of these children and people in their family. They were very close. They could also almost complete each other's thoughts. They thought alike. Her worldview was the same as his, pretty much. And so she was the perfect partner to have when she received a letter in 1775 that her husband had been picked as the head of the Continental Army, the ragtag rebel army, was going to fight for their independence. Washington in that letter told her that he didn't feel like he was up to it. You may know a little about Washington's prior history. He'd actually started a world war. I don't know if you knew this, but when he was sent out by Governor Dinwiddie as a young colonel to rid the Ohio Territory of the French, he got into a battle in which a number of people were killed on the French side and the British side. He was a colonel in the British Army, our army at that time. And it set off a world war known as the 7 Years' War. It went over into Europe and everything. And young 23-year-old George Washington actually, among his other, we don't talk about this much, but among his other credits, he started a world war. And so he was taking a lot of heat for that, though, in his early year. And he withdrew from the military. He retired from the military. In fact, that's one of the best things Washington ever did was retire. He did it a couple times from the military. Well, he did it early on before he married her. And so when he married her, I'm sure she was very well aware of his past and that he was a renowned military man. And at 6'2", he was quite tall. You can imagine Washington on a horse and leading his troops. In fact, his genius, I think, in the war was that he could have the Minutemen come back and take a second shot. Not only that, but weapons being what they were, it took a while to load again. Those flintlocks. I've got one of those down in my store if you want to see it, but my office. But anyway, the other most brilliant thing about Washington as a military leader was he could run faster than the greatest army in the world could catch him, because he'd been in that army, and he knew that they were still practicing some of the old Roman phalanxes and other things that didn't work in the United States. So he was very good at escaping, particularly New York. Our nation almost ended our fight in New York. If you want to read about how he escaped from Manhattan in the middle of a wonderful fog came up, which allowed him to escape with all of his troops before they annihilated the American army in New York. And Manhattan became the prison island of the British during the war. Most of our men that were captured that died in prison ships did it off New York. And they had New York until right at the end, after Yorktown. And then, of course, the king relented and sent his German soldiers back to England and Germany. Well, the rumors were spreading at the time of the beginning of the revolution that Martha was a loyalist, but nothing could be further, I think, because of the aristocracy and the background that she came from, planning background and all that. But Washington, she consistently shared her husband's political beliefs. She strongly supported his role in the Patriot movement and his work in advance of his beliefs and his cause. It's interesting, the parallels with Mary Lincoln a century later, because Mary Lincoln was accused of being a rebel spy. She was not, even though she had Southern leanings in her family and had two brothers that fought for the Confederacy. She was very loyal to her husband, just as Martha was to Washington in the Revolution. Well, during the Revolution, a lot of people don't realize that she spent 8 winters on the front lines. And I think she needs credit for that. She spent 8 winters with George Washington. She went to Valley Forge with him. She was at all the other places, a horrible place, Morristown, you name it. She went to every one of them. And it was at his invitation, because he didn't want to be away from her that long, He was 7 years away from his home at Mount Vernon when he accepted the head of the rebel army, and he wanted his precious Martha with him, and she came. In fact, the first time she joined him after he was sent to Cambridge at the beginning of the war, there was great festivities when she joined him. The Americans, the farmers, everybody came out to show their loyalty to George by supporting Martha on her trip to join her husband in Cambridge. And she saw some of the worst parts of the things that happened, the no shoes, the no shirts, the other things that happened. I brought one letter of her husband written. This is a handwritten letter of George Washington. He had the most beautiful penmanship of any of our presidents, bar none, even today. Especially today, our presidents don't know how to write. But as far as part of penmanship, that's what I'm trying to get to. They know how to write, but their penmanship is not like it was. Anyway, this is a letter that Washington had written on the day that he had written a previous letter to the same gentleman. The address leaf it was written out to was also signed to Robert Morris, who was the supplier of our goods and so on during the war. It's interesting how one of the things we got rid of was debtor's prison, their Constitution, and Robert Morris was in debtor's prison when Washington went to thank him for what he'd done during the Revolution. So that's one of the first things they got rid of was debtor's prison in the United States. But anyway, Robert Morris was a great patriot and sacrificed like everybody, everything he had for the cause. Anyway, Washington had written an earlier letter to him on this very day, 20th of June, 1780, at Springfield. Springfield, Mass. That's where my wife and I served our last mission. So I kind of thought it was neat. That's where Henry Knox and George set up our first armory and where they built our weapons. And it became the U.S. Army Armory for Springfield rifles and Springfield whatever until it was ended during the Vietnam War and became a museum. By the time we were there, it was a museum. If you ever get a chance to go to Springfield, it's a museum for a lot of things, but that's one of them, is the old artillery and the weapons they made. But anyway, Washington earlier had written on this day, just to give you a little taste of what he went through, a letter to Morris said, "Can you send us some shirts? None of our men in the Maryland line have shirts." One of the things Martha did was to make shirts. When she was there, she was making shirts, and it ties right in with his letters and requests. And then he added this paragraph to this letter. The second paragraph says this, after asking for shirts: "In a struggle like ours, perplexed with embarrassments," I'm sure having to ask for shirts, stuff like that is an embarrassment, "if it should be my fortune to conduct the military helm in such a manner as to merit the approbation of good men and my suffering fellow citizens, it will be the primary happiness of my life, because it is the first and great object of my wishes." So that's the second paragraph of this letter. And his wife led the charge on making shirts, on visiting the hospitals, on writing letters for the troops, on helping them get well. She did more than any other first lady I can think of, except for maybe Eleanor Roosevelt in American history, on helping the troops that were in the actual war and so on. Well, during the time she went back after the beginning of the Revolutionary War, she did not stay at Mount Vernon. She did not want to be the object of the enemy attacking Mount Vernon, because Washington's wife lived there, and Virginia was certainly in the throes of the battles. And so she went to live with her husband's brother-in-law. And a lot of people didn't know where she was during the time that she was not with George. She was in another home in Virginia. The Revolution, as I say, was the first time in their marriage they were ever separated for an extended period. And she had all of the wives of the generals. She invited them to join so that they could help make shirts and help the wounded and help write letters home communication was very poor, of course, and other things. So she did some important work during all of that time, which I think needs to be recognized, okay, and hasn't been. If it hadn't been for these women, the men would not have been able to fight. And many of them would have been too sick if they hadn't been nursed back to health. Well, the revolution became increasingly stressful for Martha after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, as George faced increased risks at that time on the battlefield. Each winter, Washington would join her husband. She'd join her husband, as I mentioned, in the encampments when the fighting was stalled. General Lafayette, the young French general who became like a son to them, to both of them. In fact, when the 50th anniversary of the Revolution was going to be held, and President Monroe wanted to invite all the generals that were still alive, they were all dead except for Lafayette. So he was the only one that was invited from France to come to the United States and to celebrate. General Lafayette observed that Martha loved, quote, her husband madly, unquote. So we have that description from Lafayette. It's interesting that Lafayette's son actually lived with them for a period of time, 2 years, during the late 1790s. Also, at the end of the Revolutionary War, there was a famous organization. It wasn't the like we have the veterans of foreign wars or anything, because it happened here, but it was an organization that had beautiful medals made for each of the generals that served in the war. And most of the generals' medals, they were very ornate. They were made in Paris, and they were after the war, and they were very fancy. They had the eagle and some other things on there. I should have brought a picture. Beautiful. But they could never find George Washington's medal until about 30 years ago. It was found at La Grange, Lafayette's home. It had been given to Lafayette by the general. And Lafayette named a son George Washington Lafayette after George Washington. He was the son they never had, and was very dear to them throughout their lives. He was also imprisoned, as you know, when he went back to France during the French Revolution for supporting the Americans during the American Revolution. He violated the King of France, Louis XVI's order that they shouldn't be directly involved, and so he was thrown in the Bastille. Nearly lost his life. His wife was too. So miraculous when you read their story about how they got saved and how they eventually were able to go home themselves. And so he was the one remaining general from the Revolution 50 years later that was invited by the United States Congress to visit us during our 50th celebration of being a nation. So there was a lot of respect there, and of course the French ultimately helped us win that war. We got around the king by getting Legras and some others to basically hound Cornwallis till he gave up his sword at Yorktown in 1781. Any of you been to Yorktown? It's kind of an interest. We got up on a cliff looking down at where that battle took place. Well, when the Continental Army settled at Valley Forge, the third of the 8 winter encampments of the Revolution, and on December 19, 1777, Martha traveled 10 days and hundreds of miles to join her husband in that forbidden place in Pennsylvania. At any rate, on April 6, another friend, Elizabeth Drinker, and 3 friends arrived at Valley Forge to plead with the generals to release their husbands from jail. All Quakers had refused to swear loyalty to the oath of the American Revolution. Because the commander was not available at first, the women met with Martha. Drinker later described her in her diary as, quote, a sociable, pretty kind of woman, unquote. So they got their husbands off. Washington's remaining son, John, Martha's last son, they called him Jackie, was serving as a civilian aide for his father-in-law, his stepfather, during the siege of Yorktown, the last major battle of 1781, when he died of camp fever. So He'd left a family with 4 children and a wife. And so Martha lost all the children before she had died. And he was in his 20s when he died. The Washingtons took the 2 youngest of John's 4 children, Eleanor Nellie Parke Custis and George Washington Parke Custis. Many of the letters of George later were written to George Washington Parke Custis. The Washingtons also provided personal financial support to the children of many of their relatives and friends. She survived long enough to have 23 great-grandchildren, half of whom died before she did, because it was so bad. Well, her post-war retirement, when the war ended in 1783, and I have a letter in our collection I didn't bring. It's in my book. It's my favorite Washington letter, which is written to, on the day they received notice that Fat George was not going to send any more Germans to fight us. We'd won our independence. And his chaplain of New York wrote him a letter. And that chaplain's letter's in the Madison Library of Congress. But I have Washington's response to it in our collection. And it's the letter to him said, your name now, General, is going to be known throughout all our history. They're going to be naming streets and towns and territories and states and even children after you. And all those things have happened many times since. How do you respond to that? Well, Washington wrote him back a letter from camp. He says, I appreciate your words on the happy event of peace with the establishment of our liberties and independence. But I hope in the midst of our joys we shall not forget that to divine providence is to be ascribed the glory and the praise. This was a great man. He could have taken a private bow, but he knew from whence we won our independence. Well, after the war, Washington was not fully supportive of her husband's agreeing to be president of the United States. I mean, you think of how we kept pulling Washington out of retirement. I should say that letter I just quoted to John Rogers, the chaplain, had a P.S. on it that he wrote out. He says, P.S. Be so good to tell me whether Mrs. Thompson is with you in New York or gone back to Philadelphia before I retire from the service. And then he completes the line. Most important thing Washington did was to retire from the service, because many of his men that were not getting paid by Congress, nothing new there, right? Wanted to rebel. They wanted, in fact, Colonel Nicolai wrote the famous letter to him, proclaim yourself king. You know, we're used to a king. And George made it a point in his letters never to show emotion. His early letters show more than his later ones, because he knew that we'd be reading his letters. And he and Jefferson both did that. They both made though their letters are very dry emotionally later on. But he didn't want to show emotion, but he showed more emotion on that response to the colonel that suggested he declare himself king. He said, look, we've fought one George for 7 years, we don't want another. That was right in his letter. And he was quite angry over the proposal. He wanted to just retire. He wanted to go back and invent a new version of grapes or whatever at Mount Vernon. He wanted to be left alone. But we would never leave the poor guy alone, which meant that Martha had to go with him because she was so fully supportive of her husband. So when you think of the times that, he'd retired from the service as a British colonel when we called him out of retirement to lead our armies. And 7 years later, he retires. And then we call him out again because the Articles of Confederation are no good in leading the 13 colonies to do anything together. They're fighting each other all the time. Can't decide on anything. And so who's going to lead the Constitutional Convention? Well, they get George to come out of retirement again. And he thought his job was done. And then they create the office of President of the United States. And guess who gets called out of retirement again? They'd be the first President of the United States. Well, I don't know if you're aware of this, but when George Washington was, I don't know how many of you have been to Wall Street and seen where he took the oath as our first president. It's on the steps there. They have a statue there next to Trinity Church. And Martha was nowhere to be found. She didn't go for another month. She didn't want to support him as president, but she loved her husband so much that she eventually came. She kept trying to talk him out of being president of the United States. And that was the first real difference that they had It was when they finally called him out the third or fourth time you're going to lead this Constitution. He always felt the word with Washington was duty. It's like with MacArthur was said later. It was duty, and he felt a duty. Eventually, she, because of her love for him, she stuck with it, and she came. It's interesting when her journey, when she came to Washington, it was a month and a half after he was sworn in on March 4th. She didn't come till May 1789 to New York. It was during this journey that she gave her only public speech as First Lady, although we didn't call her First Lady then. She was known as Lady Washington. And I brought a little card over here that I wanted to show. It's the only one I've seen, but it's a card from, it just says General and Lady Washington. And this little card from, and that's what she preferred. But some people call her Lady Washington. Nobody called her the First Lady. That was done years later when Abigail was in the White House. But they called her Lady Washington, and some people would refer to as Her Highness Lady Washington. She hated that. But, you know, again, we've gone from having a king or a queen to this. You know? So there was some transition involved with that. And they transitioned very well as a couple together. Washington, she was tasked by her husband with the responsibility of hosting drawing room events every Friday. So every Friday she hosted congressmen, she hosted events for other people and other guests. And it was also Martha that told them all that he retired at 9 p.m. So they had to know that was the president's schedule. They still kept calling him the general when he was president. That was, president was a new term then. The social circles that she developed among those in American politics this time became known as the Republican Court. I hadn't heard that, but that's what they called it back then, which was interesting. On a personal note, the capital was moved eventually from New York. She didn't like New York. They lived in 3 different homes there. The first one was too small for her liking, of course, having built Mount Vernon, you can see why. And they moved her to another more palatial house on High Street, and that was the better one. She much preferred, though, her Philadelphia residence when they moved the capital of Philadelphia, as it had greater social life there, and it was a lot closer to Mount Vernon, so she could make a few trips down to Virginia. Early in her husband's presidency, she had little opportunity to go out, as any action she took would have political implications. Does that sound familiar? Right at the beginning, she's being watched all the time. She didn't like that at all. And at any rate, while serving as First Lady, Washington became close to Polly Lear, the wife of her husband's secretary, Tobias Lear. The only letter I've ever owned of hers is this one, and it's written to Tobias Lear. And it's basically just a short note on taking care of something at Mount Vernon. He became the head of the household there after the death of her husband. And this is another thing. Before she died in 1802, she destroyed all the letters that George had written her and that she had written him. Historians have never forgiven Martha for that. 2 of the letters miraculously survived. One was found behind a cupboard that was being torn out during the time the Mount Vernon Ladies Association got hold of it in the mid-19th century. And it's a very loving letter from George to his dear wife, and you can see the love that they had for one another in that. Her letters, we don't have hardly anything. I don't think we have got a single letter of hers from George to George. Not a single one. But 2 of the ones of George survived just because they showed up in different places. But like I say, historians have never forgiven her for that. Some people say her husband ordered that, but I don't think so. I think that was her nature. We don't have one single letter of Martha as a young lady growing up or as married to her first husband. Not one. So she made particular point of getting rid of her personal life, destroying it, which I think was something she preferred, but, historians have never forgiven her for that. At any rate, when she learned that her husband might take on a second term as president, she very uncharacteristically protested against the decision. Despite her opposition, he was elected again unanimously, only president elected unanimously by the in 1793, and she reluctantly accepted 4 more years as the wife of the president. And that's when the young George Washington D. Lafayette lived with them for the presidential home for 2 years. They raised him as part of it. She often would try to take her friends and relatives to museums, to shows. She also made a point of frequently attending church, owing to her firm Episcopalian beliefs. And she read the Bible for a solid hour every day. She did that from the time, we think, she was a youth, because she kept that habit up her whole life. She had to present the United States as the Lady Washington as a dignified nation to establish credibility among the countries of Europe, but she also had to respect the spirit of democracy by refusing to present herself as a queen. So that, if you think about that, that was a tough row to hoe for her. And she got criticized by one side or the other as the Federalists became more a determining party in the United States, and the Democrats, Democratic Republicans, started to rise under Jefferson, who unfortunately became, even though he'd been Secretary of State of Washington, became his nemesis later on, which is too bad. But there were a lot of fallings out among our early founding fathers as what came to politics later on. She found the pageantry of the presidency to be boring and artificial. She was criticized, like I say, by the Anti-Federalists as emulating royalty and encouraging aristocracy. At the same time, other critics accused her social activities of being way too informal. So she got hit on both sides of it, just like our people have been ever since in those offices, whether true or not. To her displeasure, she found that she was constantly the subject of public attention, and she was forced to pay increased attention to her hair and clothes each day. Despite this, she still opted to dress simply in homespun clothes, feeling that it was more appropriate in a republic. So she did it as a political thing too. Well, she feared in 1797 after he retired, and many of you know that he issued a farewell address as president in 1797. I don't know how many of you know that he never gave it as an address. It was just released in a newspaper. And many years ago, I had the opportunity to get his rough draft. It was written on the newspaper in his handwriting, making corrections. This is 50 years ago, and they wanted $50,000 for it. And I was trying to figure how I could mortgage my life to get that, but I couldn't do it. Anyway, I don't know where it ended up. But I got to hold it for a short time. And but it was his rough draft on the newspaper that he issued his farewell address to. So it was nice just to see it for a while. George died of a severe throat infection on December 14, 1799. Before his death, there was a move by President Adams to try to have him lead an army against a possible war with France. That never happened, thank heavens. But it also shows how short some of our treaties and loyalties are as a country. We run into that every day now. But he died in 1799. I once had a letter written on December 10th, 4 days before he died. I went to Mark Hoffman, unfortunately, in the trade. But in that, he said, if I should live another year, well, he only lived 4 more days, so it didn't happen. As a widow, Martha spent her final years living in a garret where she knitted, sewed, and responded to letters all the time and visitors. She moved out of their larger bedroom to a smaller bedroom on the 3rd floor. And She retained an interest in the presidency after her tenure as First Lady, beginning the tradition of advising her successors. So Abigail spent some time with her and so on. Anyway, one of the things that she did, she also inherited her husband's slaves. He had about 123 slaves, and on the condition that they be freed upon her death was in his will. But she was fearing that these slaves of his might hurt her. In fact, there was a rumor that they set fire to Mount Vernon one night, part of it that they put out. And so she freed them all the dour slaves. She chose not to free her one slave that she personally owned. That's something to say, isn't it? Whose name was Elish, or Elish, E-L-I-S-H. Any rate, that was a different day. She developed a fever in 1802. At that time is when she burned all her husband's letters and her own. She summoned a clergyman to administer the last communion and chose her funeral dress. So 2.5 years after her husband died, she died on May 22nd, 1802. He'd been 67, she was 70 by that time. It's interesting, during the Revolutionary War when she was staying at Valley Forge, one regiment renamed themselves Lady Washington's Dragoons in her honor. So she had the great respect of the men that were fighting for her independence. The very first postage stamp featuring a woman was Martha Washington. It was issued in 1902 in a series. And a number of other things have been done in her honor over the time, including a school, Martha Washington School, and some other things. Just as another footnote, she was the second woman to appear on an American banknote after Pocahontas. And finally, I just want to share, I brought Washington's wallet here today so you can see that. He gave it to his nephew, 1762. It's got an engraving around it. And like I mentioned the letter, but this thing I wanted to end up with. The United States, under our U.S. Constitution, which Washington headed that up, decided that coinage wasn't going to be done by all these 13 states anymore. They weren't going to issue banknotes anymore. It's all going to be done by the federal government, okay? And the only problem was the federal government had no copper, no silver, and no gold. So how are you going to mint coins? Well, Ben Franklin came up with the idea on the penny, the first cent, which was a large cent. It was about this size, and it was known as the Fujo cent. I should have brought one of those. But it's about this size, and it's got a sundial on the front with the word Fujo, which means time flies. And the first U.S. motto on a coin was, "Mind your business," which I think ought to be brought back, don't you? That was Franklin's idea. And the back of it had a chain with 13 links, and in the middle it had, "We are one." Well, frankly, we've never been one, except when we come together to fight for a purpose, or we come after tragedy like Pearl Harbor or 9/11 or the Kennedy assassination. We've never really been one as a nation. We keep fighting each other. That's part of the glory of America in a way, but it's also part of a detriment if you look at that side of it. But at any rate, that's how we got the copper. It was the copper bands that held the powder kegs together that the French sent us. That's the only copper we had during the war. And no silver. So the tale goes, the legend, we don't know if it's true or not, that Thomas Jefferson, who was given the orders with Alexander Hamilton to come up with our first U.S. official coin, the Fujo cent was the first under the Constitution, but the first as a national government after the Constitution was enacted in 1788 after it had been finalized by the 13 colonies, states. They had no silver, and the story goes that they came to Lady Washington and asked if they could melt her silver service down to make the United States' first silver coins. Now, whether that's true or not, it's a tale that's come down. And when the legend is such a good story, we go with it, right? So, probably didn't happen that way. There's other things other stories that Jefferson took out a loan and got the silver. But anyway, prefer the one that they came to George and Martha. There's even a painting or two on that were done. The guy Harper who made those coins was not the official. They hadn't opened the mint officially yet either, Philadelphia. So he made them in his basement. Took him 4 days, and he made 1,500 of these little coins. I'll pass this around so you can see it. And this, I got an enlarged one so you can see it. I'll pass that around too in a minute. It's a tiny little coin. Washington, in his first address to the Congress, which we call State of the Union now, but it was his first address to the Congress in New York, said, "We made a small start on the coinage of the United States." And he mentioned that the U.S. half dime, or it's not called disme, although it's spelled that way, D-I-S-M-E. It's a French word. We dropped the S the next 2 years, so it just became dime. But we use the French term on this coin. And as you see it, the obverse has Lady Liberty. And many people believe this is a portrait of Martha Washington on this coin. Okay, I'll pass this around. And the coin is so tiny that everything's abbreviated. Up above her head it says Lib, L-I-B period. That's Liberty, parent of science and industry. That's what it says around it. And then on the back, there's a, looks like sort of a sick eagle. A little bird on the back. And on the back of it, it says United States of America, half dime or disme or dime, if you want to call it the way it's pronounced. But anyway, that's a blow up of the coin. It's a rare coin. And out of, I actually started in coin collecting, but I had to give it up. It got too expensive. Too many forgeries. And, but at any rate, this is an original, the little coin. And it's known as the half dime, 1792, and it's supposedly our first silver coin. It is our first silver coin, whether it came from her silver or Jefferson got it and put it together, I don't know. But they made 1,500 of these little coins. There's about 200 to 300 of them known today, and so that's an original there. That's one of them. So they're kind of a rare little coin. I guess I shouldn't stop on a legend, but in many cases, Martha Washington's become a legend. So she was a great lady. She fought right along her husband and the other men and women that fought, and children that fought for our independence. We achieved it against impossible odds, and I'm just grateful that we started out with a couple like this, so we're kind of parents to our country and worked together to establish the beginnings on a good plane. Thank you.